Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds, supporting children who have disclosed trauma. My name's Chris Dolman, and I work with Emerging Minds, National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health, And I'm really delighted to be with you this evening and to be a part of this conversation, to be part of really taking a closer look at ideas and practices that can support practitioners to respond in helpful ways to children who have disclosed trauma. So I'm looking forward to shortly introducing you to our panellists, but there's a couple of things that are quite significant that I'd like to be speaking about next. So next slide, please. Yes, MHPN and Emerging Minds wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our webinar panellists and participants are located. We wish to pay respect to elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Indigenous Australia, and indeed acknowledge the many diverse skills and know-how that Aboriginal families and communities continue to draw on to support children's well-being and these knowledges that are linked to long histories in culture. So, we acknowledge all of those things. Next slide, thank you. This webinar this evening is the fourth webinar in our fifth series on infant and child mental health, presented by Emerging Minds and MHPN. There's some other webinars coming up in this series this year. The first couple are decolonising mental health and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, and also responding to childhood bullying. So if you'd like to stay in touch about when they're being presented, you're welcome to subscribe to the Emerging Minds news, or also sign up to the MHPN portal as well. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so there's just some instructions about how to use this platform, really to get the most out of tonight's webinar. That ellipsis button, the three dots there, you're welcome to click on that and access features such as the information and ask a question functionality. If you'd like to access presentation information or links to the live chat, which is offered as part of this webinar, resources or other technical support, click on that information button in the lower right corner of your screen. So, Okay, next slide, please. So the learning aims for this evening, just so you know where we're all headed with this, this discussion is, we'll be discussing ways that self-blame occurs with children who have experienced trauma, and how it is commonly manipulated by perpetrators to support secrecy and silence surrounding the abuse that children have experienced. We'll be identifying strategies that practitioners can introduce to children and parents to help them make sense of their experiences in ways that challenge and undermine self-blame. And we'll also be discussing how the power difference between children and adults can be made overt in sessions with children to help challenge and undermine those feelings of complicity for the abuse they've been subjected to. So there's some of the themes that we'll be covering this evening. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so tonight's panel. Now you've already received a bit of a description of our panel's backgrounds and professional interests. And so it is my pleasure to welcome David, Tully, Clare Klapdor and Kate Headley to this webinar. And so rather than kind of reiterate their bios, I'd like to instead ask them a question to help them, to help locate them, I guess, in this work. And I guess, firstly, to you, Kate, welcome. It's lovely to have you joining us this evening. As a speech therapist, what is it that continues to draw you to this area of practice?
Hello, thank you, and thank you for having me. Look, I do feel really strongly about this area of practice because we know that overwhelmingly children who've experienced complex trauma are at a higher risk for having difficulties with their developing communication skills. And that just adds to their vulnerability that they face to having challenges across their lifetime. And so I really feel passionately that we can use language and communication supports as a really protective factor for children who've had these life experiences.
Great, thanks, Kate. We're really looking forward to your presentation in a little while. And also welcome to Clare. Also lovely to have you joining us this evening. Clare, you're a social worker who's worked in many different contexts where you've been called on, you and your colleagues, to respond to children who've experienced abuse and violence and disclosures of trauma. Like, what is it that you find kind of sustains you in your practice?
So that's a great question. I find that excellent supervision sustains me, really helpful conversations with peers and colleagues and other professionals help sustain me. And for me, I think my particular joy in this work is whole of family approach. And I really find a lot of joy in supporting families where they've also felt the impacts of their children experience sexual abuse and strengthening them to be the most important support in the child's life.
Great. And once again, looking forward to the experience that you bring to our discussion tonight. So thank you, Clare. And welcome to David Tully. David, as a practice leader with Relationships Australia SA, working with and supporting a number of practitioners in this area of practice. What is it that you're really keen to make sure practitioners kind of understand, or what is it you're really keen to ensure that they sort of know that sort of can support them in terms of how they go about their work?
For me, it's about having a certain knowledges and understandings that are actually going to be useful for the work, and this work's going to move you in many different ways in terms of impacts and effects, but to feel you have a framework or way of working that's actually going to help children, young people, and as Clare says, their families as well, think differently around these issues. And certainly we're going to take a deep dive into self-blame in a minute, but self-blame isn't true. It's not the reality of what people should be feeling and thinking about themselves. So having practitioners or frameworks that actually can help shift some of those, I think, is really important.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Thank you, David. And looking forward, as you said, to a closer examination of self-blame and ways to undermine its effects in children's lives and the lives of families more broadly. So thank you for that. We had some questions prior to the webinar about whether tonight's discussion will include working with children who've been subjected to child sexual abuse. And so we wanted to say yes, that will be a part of our discussion, absolutely. And so when we talk about trauma, we're really referring to interpersonal trauma that children experience. Most commonly child abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, control, coercion, threats, and also including the trauma that children experience through witnessing adult coercive control and violence as well. So, just to set that context, and it's a very reasonable question, I guess, in terms of has me thinking even about the language, really, that we use to describe children's experience, trauma or abuse or violence. That language has different implications, I guess, for how we even think about what we do. So thank you for that question as well. So, so we're going to move into the presentations now. Then after a short presentation from each panellists will then move into a question and answer time. So please continue to submit questions. There's already a couple that have come through. So, so I'd first like to invite David to speak to his response to the case study that you've all received in relation to 11-year-old boy Taj, and some of the important considerations and practices that David is wanting to speak about. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Chris. And even that comment you said really important around trauma. And, if we're dealing with a particular type of trauma, which is child sexual abuse, it's important there's some general knowledge around trauma that's going to be really important, but we need to also understand some really specifics about the context that sexual abuse occurs in to be useful, I think, as well. So one of the key knowledges I was introduced, when I started working as a practitioner around helping children, young people and adults overcome the impacts of sexual abuse is this idea that the social context that abuse occurs in. One way of understanding is what we call the politics of abuse. So understanding that abuse always occurs in a context where there's power differences, and those power differences can be many and varied depending on the social context that cause them. But it's not just about power differences when the power differences are actually misused as well. So I think that's important. And often children, young people, when there's this power difference, has a massive impact on the way they can make meaning and sense of these experiences. And as I said, we're going to deep dive on self-blame. So how does a child, young person separate from a feeling of self-blame, or their parents who, hadn't done the harm to them, separate from feeling of self-blame as well? So this impacts about how also other people and other systems actually respond. And a lot of the harm around child abuse is done obviously by the person who chooses to harm the child, but also by the way we respond as systems and processes as well, and can reinforce or disengage from self-blame as well. Thank you. So next slide. So very importantly, if we start from an understanding that children, young people can only make sense of the abuse based on their current level of cognitive thinking, language, ability to process information, their physical stage of development, their emotional stage of development, and their social development at the time. As adults, we have different ways of making meaning and sense of these, but that initially that a child, young person only has those resources to make sense of this experience as well. So often then the feelings of self-hatred, which can be really debilitating, and shame are often indicative of a child's confusion to attribute responsibility, and often to blame themselves for the assault. And very importantly, the tactics of abuse often are about obscuring that developmental process, suggesting a child can make adult decisions. And to use Taj as an example, Taj was 9 at the time when the abuse was occurred. So we've got to really tune into what it means to be 9 and, what ways 9-year-olds think, the language they have, their stage of development as well. And the other important bit within this scenario around Taj is also that it was an uncle. So it was a person who sits in potentially a circle of trust within a family system as well. So that's going to have huge impacts in the way Taj can make sense of that experience as well. Thank you. Next slide. So self-blame can come in many different forms. And as I said, some of that might be indicative of a child just trying to make meaning, but a lot of them are also through the tactics that the child has imposed upon them as well. So, I know this is hard to think about, but it's very important we're ready to actually hear the way children and young people might be hooked into self-blame. It might be that I took the money, he gave me $10. I must deserve it because I'm a bad kid, or something about me. I enjoyed the attention. I liked that my uncle took me out and rode trail bikes and, paid, and I really liked that bit of it, but I didn't like this other stuff. But maybe it was because I wanted to spend time with him, it was my fault. That they just didn't stop it somehow, whether it by physical force or telling somebody. Maybe that they, constructing this sense of being weak or a wimp because I didn't fight the person off. Something about me, if we're talking a young man who's at a development stage where he may have an erection, he may be, nobody can force you to get it up, And the tactics of abuse, where maybe they felt like they were an active agent in that abuse as well. And I should have told sooner as well. But all of these forms of self-blame have a certain underpinning of understanding that a child or young person can actually consent or understand what's going on. And as a community, we think have a very important value that children and young people can't understand these things and can't actively consent. And then therefore, if it's not consent, it's not sex, it's actually violence. And that's a really important distinction between what is sex and what is violence. And what we're talking around, while we use the language of abuse, it's an act of violence, of force. Both psychological and physical force can be elements of that as well. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So in understanding the notions of self-blame and how they come into it, it's important that we understand that there's multiple things that actually feed self-blame. There's a developmental process, the stage of development, which I've sort of spoke about. There's also the politics of abuse, the ideas and beliefs that sit within our community and society about, some of that worst ways that children and young people are made sense of as well. And the tactics that perpetrators then use utilise both of those processes to have the child or young person forming beliefs about themselves and what's happened as well. And those beliefs, if they particularly are strongly hooked into self-blame, often then feed a lot of the effects that we see presented, flashbacks of anxiety, depression, risk-taking, self-harm, struggling with being in schools, those sort of things as well. But I think it's important to know that even within that beliefs of self-blame, there may be in some ways that children and young people know on one level it wasn't their fault as well, and there's going to be a sort of a struggle to make meaning of that and needing that sort of support, social support, other sorts of supports to help that meaning that it's not their fault, being really, really critical as well. Okay, next slide. So just on the board, as I said, we could spend half an hour just pulling apart some of these things, but it's just trying to give you some sort of ideas or some windows that might inspire or think differently. And this is one that was, golly gee, spoke to me probably over 20 years ago, but it still has management use. And so what you would do, say, if you were sitting down with Taj, and he was struggling about talking about his own experience, you'd maybe ask him to maybe think about another child, another 9-year-old boy, or so it's not about you. Let's just think about another 9-year-old boy, and if we put this 9-year-old boy with responsible adults, and then you sort of spend a bit of time pulling apart what responsible adults. And I've worked with children and young people who've had really contexts that are really quite overwhelmingly lots of violence and abuse, but they still often know what a trusted. They have a teacher who's been good to them or somebody else. So they'll be able to sort of name what a responsible adult is, trustworthy, fair, honest, reliable. So it's even that's concept development stuff. It's important. Then we talk about irresponsible adults. What qualities do they show? Manipulation, unfair, lie, tricky, self-centered. And obviously you're trying to use words and language that your young person or the child would use, so this is just some examples. I think this child was a little bit older, maybe 12 from memory as well. So what would then this 9-year-old boy thinking, Taj, as well? If with responsible as my needs count, I'm loved, I'm safe, I can count on others. So if you put this 9-year-old without adults who are responsible, what am I thinking? My needs don't count, I can't trust people, it's my fault, I'm bad. Okay, so is this really about this 9-year-old boy, or is this about the adults that's around them as well? And often a child, young people might be really struggling with self-blame for themselves as an idea or concept, can often really clearly name that another child wouldn't be responsible. And that just gives us some opportunities to develop some concepts that we can help bring back to them and sort of help understand the power context that abuse occurs in a way that sort of helps build up those concepts that isn't just tell me everything that happened to you, Taj, as well, which can help with developing a framework to later set up so that child can process some of these experiences in a way that they don't see it's about them and it's not about their weaknesses or their fault in any way as well. Okay, next slide. So again, and just another someone we can spend a bit of time, but I was really introduced to some of these ideas by a counsellor I work with, my initial supervisor, Maxine Joy, and just actually how do we actually make visible the politics of power and establish responsibility as a very important central platform of other therapeutic work that can happen. And there's lots of things we can do, but if a child's blaming themselves, we're just helping them deal with the effects of that self-blame. I'd rather shift the self-blame as well. So, this is us to establish some context with this young person or child, but questions might be, well, who idea was it to do those things, to play the game, muck around with the bedroom? Who thought up those ideas? Who decided the when, what, how of what happened? Who suggested not to tell and call it a secret? Was that something you came up with, or was that somebody else? Whose feelings were important? Whose desires were being catered for? Whose interest being provoked? Who do you think was responsible? And you obviously would take this to language and concepts, a child, young person, but it's being really clear that the decisions around the abuse weren't their decisions. They might have liked going, as I said, Taj might have liked going trail bike riding with his uncle, but he didn't want the abuse, and to actually separate out those two things as well. Okay, next slide. And just also really importantly, as I said, like children and young people are never passive, but actually making meaning of the abuse within the context, both their social context and their stage of development as well. And even a child who's deeply hooked into self-blame would have other beliefs that we can potentially give a bit more space and connect some of the stories about why that child doesn't blame themselves. So some different categories here around stories of protests, in ways that they cried or pleaded or even crossed their arms and turned away. That's a protest. So a responsible adult would see that as a sign that they shouldn't be doing those sort of behaviours. Her stories of resistance, hiding, trying to tell, and running away, all those sort of things are the way within the context of what that child could be doing, trying to step away from the impacts of abuse. Also, their resilience, their, things that they did to get through, and, amazing stories of children and young people doing things to protect others. Well, if he's abusing me, I knew he wasn't abusing my younger brother, as an example. Or learning tobacco, or having imaginary friends, or even deeply connecting to pets, and that can be another way that they keep those connections going as well. And other ways that they've sort of kept connected to other people. As I said, it could be a trusting teacher. It could be, a friend down the road who, they go over there and they know that family where these things don't happen, and that can be a way they can remain in connection. So, these are the things that actually help a child develop some solid ground to be able to start to have some conversations that aren't just based on the system's needs. So in Charge's situation, he had to tell in the context of making a statement for police and courts, but, to actually feel solid as he tells these stories as well. Okay, well, I think we now hand over to Claire. I think, Chris?
We do. Thanks very much, David. Yeah, over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was a really great overview from David about how self-blame manifests. And I want to talk a little bit about how us as professionals can inadvertently contribute to secrecy, which can then contribute to self-blame. As we know, perpetrators can really rely on secrecy to protect themselves and continue the abuse of children. So placing the blame for the abuse onto the child really increases the likelihood that the child's not going to tell anyone. So it becomes very difficult for children to actually initiate conversations around their experience of abuse. Now, in the example with Taj, he has disclosed and he's come to us post-disclosure for support around the abuse. But that doesn't mean he is going to initiate that conversation with us. As David mentioned, he may have had to make statements. This might have been very stressful. He might not be wanting to talk about it in the same way. And I think accidentally, professionals can fall into a trap well-intentioned of not wanting to cause more distress and more discomfort for a child. We don't want to trigger their trauma in any way. We don't want to send them home to family and carers, with traumatised behaviours, including self-harm. So what we can tend to do is fall into the trap of thinking, as long as we provide a really safe environment for this child and we do lots of fun things, the child will talk to us when they are ready. But without the words and experience in having these kinds of conversations, children may not open up. Taj at 11 is still super young, and he might just not know how to broach that conversation. If we continue to avoid taking ownership of initiating that conversation, we can just contribute that this is secret. Even though I'm here to talk to this person, they're not talking to me about it. So this maybe is a secret, and that feeling of blame can go on. Next slide, please. So I've put a few strategies here that I believe it's up to us as professionals to initiate that conversation with children. In Taj's example, the professional has decided to raise this in the third session, allowing a couple of sessions for rapport building, building trust, introducing the physical space, getting to know the child outside of the problem and the abuse, which is really important. But fairly early on into the relationship, they've broached that subject. So I really like to prepare the child that I'm going to ask a question or talk about something or do an activity that might be hard for them. I don't want to take them by surprise. So I might simply say, Taj, I want to ask you a question now, and this might be a hard question for you to answer, or this might make you feel sad or angry and embarrassed. It's really okay to have all of those feelings. I also then like to put the child in as much control as possible of that conversation, giving them permission to stop if they don't want to talk about it, or say they don't know, they don't understand, or even end the session and go back to a carer if that's what they want. Many times, even with children Taj's age and older, I've made up cards with little phrases on them, like answers. I don't know, I don't want to answer, it's too hard, ask me a different question. And so I'll give them those cards and explain how they use it because they're the boss of the conversation. And that way, if they don't have the confidence when we're talking about a child who's experienced abuse of power with adults, this can help them find the voice to do that. When introducing the conversation, not to use ambivalent terms. I want to talk about the incident. I want to talk about why you've come here. Something a little bit more specific. So I would like to talk to you, Taj, about what happened with Uncle Craig, or I'd like to talk to you about what happened at piano lessons, something to provide context about what you're going to start talking about. And then that continual check-in. Is it okay if I ask you another question? Or is it okay if we do a drawing activity about this? Or if I ask a question and I'm sensing some hesitancy or fear, I might say, would you like to use one of your cards on me now? Do you want to be the boss of the conversation now? And then at the end of the discussion or activity, do you think it might be okay if we talked about this again the next time we see each other? Again, preparing them now for what might come at the next session. Next slide, please. And throughout this, really acknowledging how they're breaking the silence. It's a huge achievement. So, congratulating the child on this achievement of removing the secrecy. I really like to do activities to help connect with how is the child feeling about the discussion, and I might use some scaling visuals around how to do that. Are they feeling really terrible about it? Was it hard? They feel good about it, because that can really help me prepare for the next session. And also not forgetting the fun, so important. We've had that rapport building in the first 2 sessions with Taj, but I'd be opening the session with something playful and fun. You might only want to do 5 to 10 minutes of this serious business and this serious conversation, depending on the child and their responses, and then moving back into fun. That's really so important. Next slide. Just briefly looking at parents and carers and their self-blame. Parents and carers can hold enormous amounts of self-blame. If we looked at Uncle Craig in Taj's example, if that he was Mum's brother, Mum might be holding incredible amounts of self-blame for the abuse that happened to Taj. She enabled the contact. It was her brother, and parents can just find it really hard to forgive themselves for this. And it's really important to the child's well-being that we also support the parents' well-being where we can, and unpack their feelings of self-blame. They will have also been groomed or manipulated by the perpetrator as well, and we might have to undo with that. Next slide, please. Just some strategies, lots of psychoeducation. We're working with parents and really educating them on how the manipulation occurs, both to the child and them, really normalising their experiences of self-blame, lots of self-compassion work. And then some strategies about, really importantly, how they can break down secrecy and silence with their child by not shutting off conversations when their child initiates that conversation with them. Going to counselling might help the child feel more confident about bringing it up and want to talk about it. So rather than parents shutting that conversation down because they feel afraid, instead to open it up in a safe way that's other children aren't being exposed, and being just there for comfort, even if they don't know what to say in words, offering other comfort and always making sure the child knows it's okay to talk to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks very much. And I appreciate you bringing that, the family context, into the conversation very much as well. So we look forward to exploring that further. There's been some more questions about that already. So just a reminder, folks, yes, if you'd like to put a question to the panel, please use that functionality. And over to you now, Kate to bring a speech pathologist perspective to working with Taj.
Thanks, Chris. And pardon me, everyone, I'm battling sinus at the moment. But yeah, so I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the considerations I would give in this type of context when potentially I'm not working with Taj as the primary mental health clinician, but I might have contact with Taj in my speech pathology role, and I may be working with children just after they've disclosed trauma. I might be working with them at a time that they are disclosing trauma to someone around them. So some of my initial considerations would certainly be around being mindful of my own emotional state and subsequently my body language and non-verbal communication when I first meet children. You know, it can be distressing hearing that a child has experienced abuse or disclosed abuse, and we don't want to inadvertently add to a child's sense of shame by demonstrating body language that the child might misconstrue as meaning we are uncomfortable to be around them. We also know that experiences of complex trauma can impact children's accurate interpretation of social cues and body language, and that can lead to them misinterpreting spoken information. So for that reason, I'm very mindful of and work really hard to have very neutral, relaxed body language in my interactions with children, and to intentionally observe how children are responding to me so I can adjust my body language and interpersonal style as I need to. I'm also mindful about how I provide feedback during my interactions with children. I'm really mindful that allied health professionals tend to love providing positive reinforcement and praise, which is wonderful and can be really helpful for building rapport and connection. But a range of researchers have identified that it's really important in the context of working with children who've disclosed abuse that any feedback we provide is in a context around a child's effort, not the content of the discussion. So, for example, in Taj's case, I might say something like, you know, I could see how hard you're thinking about this. That's great. Rather than something like, thanks for telling me about your uncle. So the focus on the effort. Next slide, please. To help reinforce that the child is powerful within our relationship, I often start my interactions with a child like Taj by positioning myself as the naive person in the interaction. So I might ask them open-ended questions about a topic that I know is of interest to them or an experience they've had that's not to do with the abuse. And it's something that I don't know about and couldn't know about because I wasn't there. That's been shown to be a really effective strategy for building trust and rapport, but it also will give you as the adult an opportunity to gauge that child's language skills and get a bit of insight into how they can express themselves. And it really supports that practice principle of positioning the child as the knowledge holder of their own experiences. Next slide, please. So although we never want to make assumptions about children's skills, we do know that complex trauma experienced in childhood can impact children's development. And there are higher levels of language, memory, and learning difficulties in young people who've had these experiences. So for that reason, I personally choose to take a position of least risk by implementing supports for language and memory in all the work I do with every child I have contact with. And then as I get to know that child and become more attuned to them, I learn about their skills, what their skills are and what their support needs are, and then I can fine-tune and individualise what they need. If we don't make what we are talking about accessible to the child, we are inadvertently contributing to a power dynamic that positions us in the more powerful position in the interaction. And that's in direct opposition to the therapeutic goals that David and Claire have been speaking about earlier. And it also places that child at a higher risk of feeling a sense of shame around not being able to fully understand their interactions with us. Next slide, please. If I was working with Taj, I would want to be mindful that there are areas of language and memory that can be particularly difficult for children. Simply from a developmental point of view, as David was referencing earlier, but also more extensively in the context of experiencing traumatic events in childhood. And I've listed some of those on the slide, some things to be really mindful of, because often children can mask their difficulties with these language concepts really well through a whole range of adaptive behaviours. So they might say that they understand, they might nod, smile, they might repeat information that they've heard from other places, or use a whole lot of contextual cues to pick up on little bits and pieces here and there. But when we don't provide information in a way children can fully understand, we are inadvertently colluding with secrecy. We're creating a context where children can't quite break the code, they can't get the information. So again, we would be working in direct opposition to that therapeutic goal Claire was talking about at decreasing secrecy for children. I especially note, like I just popped this last point on the slide about reading comprehension, and just being really mindful to separate a child's ability to read from their ability to comprehend what they have read. Sometimes, particularly if we're working with tweens and teens, we might give them written information to support what we're saying, or we might direct them to some written support resources. But we must make sure that that is a helpful strategy. Certainly many children that I work with can actually decode and read words, but have very poor comprehension of the information that they're reading, and they express enormous amounts of shame around that, and that feeling being increased when people assume that they can read for comprehension. And next slide, please. So the principle of co-design really aligns with our intentions of positioning the child as the knowledge holder of their own experiences. Children will often show us what works for them rather than being able to express that. So we can use our skills in observation to provide reflective statements. So I might say something like, oh, I noticed that you seem to like sitting by the window when we meet. A reflective statement like that can just start the co-design process where children are active participants in identifying what works for them. And, you know, as David mentioned, talking can be a really hard medium for a lot of children. A, because of their developmental stage, B, just because of the rates of speech, language and communication needs broadly across the Australian population, and then compounded further by the extra speech, language, communication support needs associated with complex trauma. So as practitioners, we need to be able to reflect on ways to support our conversations with children with activities that might need to let children process information and express information through showing and doing rather than necessarily talking. The other point there I've kind of noted is that children with language difficulties need extra time to process information and formulate responses, and that will be heightened at times of increased emotion. as it is for all of us. And it can be helpful to reflect on that. So being mindful that interventions may need to progress at a gentler speed, but working in your workplace to balance that with the system pressures and the stretched resources and expectations that we have on delivering services. And finally, I've just put a point there about thinking about how when we know our jobs well, it becomes like our language, and sometimes we can forget how abstract and inferred information is in the way that we speak. So, for example, I might say to someone, oh, so previously you were telling me a bit about what happened in the past and I thought we could pick up there. I have to work really hard as a practitioner to be far more explicit than that when I'm working with children, particularly if there's language support needs. So I might say something more like, last Wednesday, we were talking about when you were in year 4 with Mr. Smith as your teacher. Today, we are going to start with talking about that again, talking about when you were in year 4 with Mr. Smith. Just the same information but stated more explicitly can be really helpful. So, I guess in summary, through my work, I'm really encouraging practitioners to think about how the way we communicate with children who have disclosed abuse can contribute to the therapeutic intentions of reducing feelings of shame, secrecy, and power imbalance.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate. Actually, we've had a number of questions coming through about working with children in relation to children who are living with language difficulties. And so, folks, I also just wanted to mention that if you'd like to hear more of Kate's reflections around that topic, you're welcome to refer to the related resources handout that's connected with this webinar. And there's details about a couple of podcasts where Kate describes some of her ideas and practices in relation to that further. So great. Thanks very much, Kate. Thanks, everyone. Excuse me. Okay, so we're now going to move into a Q&A time. And again, thank you so much for all those that have already submitted questions. There's been a couple of questions about whether we ought to have access to the slides that the panellists have shared. Yes, you'll be able to have access to that, and also to the recording of tonight's webinar through the MHPN website, and also via Emerging Minds as well. So, David, there was a question about the whose idea is it practice that you described earlier, and just wanting a couple of people wanting to understand that a bit more, particularly for those children that are, who have kind of been convinced through the trickery of the perpetrator that it really was their doing, the abuse. And so in going through that practice with children, like, what is it that you sort of, what is it you're paying most sort of attention to? Is it the timing of that practice, or how do you make that kind of practice land with children?
Yeah, there's sort of two parts to that. Obviously it's about sequencing this type of work, and obviously we're just sort of giving you some ideas that are really quite important, and you want to establish a context where the child understands, and as Claire and Kay's, they get to know you, they get to know the way the process works as well. But the intent in that sort of question is through the framework of self-blame, a child will be making a story about what happened. And I'll give you a very explicit. Even adults will still carry stories about what happened. Because of something, and it might be because I ran across the room and I had a towel on. That meant that I wanted the abuse to occur. And that may be a story that's not completely dominates somebody, but it might be a story that rattles around and haunts people a little bit as well. By asking those sort of questions really around whose idea it was, it's about being really clear about whose intent it was, and that children and young people are looking for care, protection, love, acknowledgement, but they're not looking for violence and sexual violence. Sexualised violence isn't what they're wanting. So that's what those questions are really about, being really clear about whose choices and decisions around the abuse, that it wasn't their choice and decision. Because a lot of those tactics we spoke about, you took the money, therefore, and that can really leave a child with a meaning. So you think even as an adult trying to process experience as a child, if part of that meaning you've made, because I did this thing, it meant there was something about me, it's going to be really hard to be able to process and make meaning of those experiences in a way that isn't going to be restricting or debilitating or impacting. So they're really tough questions to ask. But if you do it in a way that's sort of developmentally appropriate and, and understanding of a, child's communication sort of style, most, they get that. No, I didn't choose those things. But, I wanted this, as I said, I wanted my uncle to care about me and I wanted to have fun. And, as I said, he took me motorbike riding and took me to the movies. And, but I didn't want those other things. And when I hear not me, and the point of the questions is they've made that meaning. I just haven't, it's important to tell children it's not their fault, they're not responsible. But these practices go beyond just us telling them that, and them almost cognitively restructuring some of those experiences for themselves. But it is like a real feet in the ground sort of thing to be talking about. And it does involve talking some of the specificities of some of those tactics and sometimes the abuse that occurs. And we're not doing that in a way to be gratuitous. It's just because that's where a lot of the meaning's made. Yes, I took the $10, and if that doesn't ever come out, that might be a meaning the child will live with for a while. I took the $10, therefore I must have known what was going to happen next. And those questions are about destabilising that and really helping remember the true story of what happened, not the way it's sort of they've been written on, if that makes sense. Almost they've been edited their experience by the tactics of abuse or other systems that sort of, as Claire spoke about, maintain secrecy and silence.
Great. Thank you, David. Kate, a question to you as you were speaking. Someone's asked, how do you open up the conversation about abuse with a child or young person when, the traumas have perhaps been disclosed to multiple professionals already, right? And, including child mental health, child protection, family services, there's been perhaps lots of circulation of that story of abuse or trauma. How do you is there other things you'd like to add in terms of how you might, with that knowledge that you've got, how you might bring that up with the child?
I suppose for me, I'm very mindful of my scope of practice and expertise and absolutely not contributing to secrecy for children. So even though I'm not working with them as a primary mental health professional, also wanting to model that it's okay if whenever they want to talk about this, I'm not going to not allow that. But, I think there is a space for professionals around a child who aren't in that primary mental health position to seek support and supervision around what to do when a child does disclose abuse. I've been fortunate enough to work in teams of mental health clinicians where I've learned a lot from my colleagues, and that supported me to build my confidence, to feel confident with how to respond if a child brought up a disclosure or wanted to talk about their abuse experiences. And certainly in speech pathology, it does come up a lot because I work a lot with children and teenagers around their communication difficulties. And of course, they want to understand why they're having these difficulties. And so, I will do some education with children where I teach them about some of that, in very basic terms, that neurobiology of complex trauma. And from that will often open up a conversation that's really healthy where children are starting to say, because this happened when I was little, was my brain growing other parts of my brain? And so I guess I would suggest getting training and support to feel confident with what to do in the moment, how to respond so that we're building a society that doesn't support secrecy around these discussions. And then making sure that you also know what to do with that information, who to connect with, how to share that with the family, so that you're not carrying that yourself as a professional who's not in that dedicated role.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah. Claire, there's been some questions in relation to working with non-offending parents. So perhaps I'll put this question to you in relation to, the question's about how do you work with non-offending parents, who may have doubts about the child's claims of abuse.
Yeah. And that
sounds complex.
It does, and it does come up a lot. And sometimes when parents are having doubts about the disclosure, we can be quick to move into a place of they're not protective. And I think it's really important to draw that distinction. And the importance is for the well-being of the child. We obviously need to know if the carers of the child aren't being protective, because the child's safety is paramount. But we need to be really careful that parents questioning what happened doesn't equal not being safe. So it's important to always make sure that their actions are keeping the child safe while allowing them the headspace to talk about their doubts. I can't imagine anyone ever telling me that my father or my brother has hurt a child in that way. I can't imagine what that would be like. And, to have to process that, or an older sibling. So one of your children has sexually hurt or physically hurt another child. It would be a horrific experience, and you're trying to make sense and rationalise it. And it's really important for parents to have a safe space to unpack that, because the result will be is that they will become more and more protective of their child. They will understand better how to support their child, and ultimately that's in the best interest of the child. So it's important to find someone who can take the parent through that process. And there are many different types of therapies we might engage with parents and caregivers, but it's really being clear about, are they keeping the child safe while they're having these doubts and questions? What are their actions doing? And taking action as necessary if their actions indeed aren't keeping the child safe. However, if they are, then allowing them to open up safely with you in that confidential space around those concerns.
Great, thank you, Claire. Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for all the questions that are coming through. There's also a question, David, I wanted to sort of put to you a bit about what does a practitioner do when a child is perhaps unable to sort of name the trauma because they believe they are to blame, like the secrecy and silence is so capturing of them, I guess. And shame shuts down any options to kind of process the event. There were some ways where they can just be, I guess, begun to be opened up in some way that you found helpful.
Well, and it's to be predicted, to be honest,
right.
on one level,
okay.
that shame is actually going to fill up the room and speak quite loudly, and there's a whole range of reasons why that's not, and I don't think it's inevitable. I think a lot of it, as I said, relates to the very way we structure society and children, young people and their voices and the way they experience that shame would then very fill up the room. But I think it's a couple of things for me, like it's developing those concepts around blame and responsibility, and referencing the exercise I used before around responsibility. We don't say, Taj, we talk about another child or a young person. And there's a really quite important reason why we would do that, because it allows that concept to be developed, to be built upon, stories added to it, kids understanding their own way, and you do pictures, drawings that sort of help those concepts become more concrete, which allows that shame to be destabilised in a way. And I think the other bit about other sorts of stories about the way they've responded to abuse, which is sort of some of that last stuff slide I spoke to around, stories of protest, resilience, capacity, clever thinking, and to take that's not about just patting them on the head, feel good about, which hopefully they do feel better about themselves. But these are real stories of actions that they've done as well. And that's their sense of, how do I put it, that, in the context of the politics using those power relationships, it's really important. But they sort of made decisions to keep themselves safe or reached out. I mean, the whole story in Taj, which is sort of interesting, how, he has spoken about, he got himself through a court process, the really quite huge sort of achievements. And if we understand that a little bit more, it might give a bit more ground for shame not to fill up the room so much, But as I said, using the concept of another child or young person can be particularly helpful, because often young people wouldn't blame another young person or a child, so it allows that sort of that contradiction why they're blaming themselves as well. But I think the importance is getting them to talk about these concepts. It's not just us telling them these things. This is their story as well. But and the desperation, and for us as practitioners, comes in that knowing a child's going to walk out your room still blaming themselves is a really hard thing to sit with. But similar to what Claire's saying, parents, just knowing it takes a while to process and shift that blame from one, because it's been such a capturing idea. It might take time for that shame to shift as well, and allowing that space to occur.
Thank you, David. There's another question come through about how would you approach a child? Perhaps, Claire, you might be able to say something to this, I'm sure. How would you approach a child who feels that this sort of sexual assault was somehow consensual, and feels guilty, worried about the perpetrator, the consequences for the perpetrator?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one where, and something that really stops children from talking and elaborating that it is my fault, that this has happened to the person who, although they did terrible things, I still love, and they're in jail, and that's my fault, and I put them there, and I miss them. That's something we hear as well. They don't miss the abuse and the horrible things, but they miss the nice things and the good things that they've experienced with that person. Using some of those power and politics activities that David taught to, again, at child developmental level, around understanding consequences for actions and taking it from their level and their age about what happens at school if, someone's mean to someone else, what's the consequence for that? What happens if you don't do your chores at home? What's the consequence of that? And so understanding that all behaviours have consequences, that when we engage in behaviours, we know they have consequences. So getting the child to do that for themselves, and then taking that to adults understand when they do something that there's consequences, and going through those activities about how the adult would have known that this was what was going to happen before they took the actions, regardless of what the child has said or done. So that's one strategy that you might use to work through that.
Yeah. Your comments about consequences have me thinking about sort of understanding the relational context as well of the abuse. And David, is that something, or how significant is that a part in terms of your work, to be making sure of having some understanding of the relational context in which the abuse has occurred?
Well, I think we never want a hierarchy abuse, and that's a really important thing. Sexual abuse is sexual abuse. But, the context that it occurs in has a huge impact on that relational trauma component to it as well. So if in Taj's situation, as an uncle, was a loved uncle, a cared about uncle, someone who was really respected in his community, that's going to be another huge barrier to be able to, as Claire said, there's consequences for those behaviour, but everyone else really likes him, and now I've got him off into jail, and so that relational trauma is a really important part of understanding the meaning making process. And that sense of their story about who they are and why that's why this happened to me. Was it a stranger? Because even a stranger assault can have that sort of meaning. But when it's someone close, trusted within a family system, there's a fear of being able to make meaning of it in a way that clearly has them not being at fault, and somehow I was a bad kid and this happened to me. So that relational trauma is critical. I think that we are aware of it and can be sensitive to it,
Mm-hmm.
but don't then still shy away from actually addressing the truth.
No, right.
The uncle shouldn't have done these things, and he was old enough, and he knows that you're not allowed to do those things for your children. And if two adults choose to do those sort of behaviours, and that's up to them, but they need to, but children, young people can't make those decisions, and we think that's not fair that was put upon you, and using language that's sort of sensitive to their context, but particularly understanding, what makes it abuse, what makes it violence, it's really critical around that consent, or the lack of ability to consent. So,
thank you. Yeah, there's a question, I think, for all of you, actually, around, practitioners being concerned about causing more trauma on account of speaking about the trauma, right? And we kind of can understand that concern, can't we? And particularly when you're wanting to gain greater insight into the abuse that's being perpetrated. This metaphor of ripping off like a Band-Aid is a metaphor that's sometimes used, or opening a can of worms, I guess, is another one I've heard. But the questioner asks, how to avoid causing more trauma? Like, what is it that's most important to ensure that re-traumatization isn't experienced by the child? So, Kate, would you like to begin to respond to that question, perhaps?
Well, I certainly don't feel like an expert on this topic, but I've been on quite a learning curve around that, being a speech pathologist and working then in a complex trauma treatment service.
Yeah.
And what I have overwhelmingly learned is that the damage that comes from colluding with secrecy and creating an environment of silence far outweighs any risk that might come from a conversation that I have with a child. I've been on this really steep learning curve of seeing how children's perceptions of themselves and their thinking patterns that they take throughout life can be so shaped by self-blame and shame if that secrecy is supported by the people that they express their experiences to. So I just am so mindful that, yes, there's skills and confidence to develop in having those conversations, but if nothing else, just allowing a child to speak without showing judgment is going to be helpful for not exaggerating the sense of secrecy around them.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Claire or David, is there something you'd like to add to Kate's response to what it is that can, practices that can ensure that there's not re-traumatisation in our work with children?
I talked a little bit to that in the strategies I brought up around, how to have that conversation. And I think it's, I wholly agree with Kate and the research that's been done around that in terms of the power of those conversations. But I do really like to put as much control as I can into the child's hands about how long we talk about it for, being allowed to stop the conversation, not talk about it, have it, depending on how many sessions or how many times you're seeing the child. There might be times where, like today, we don't talk about it at all. And so really sort of hearing and listening and watching the child and being very in tune to them, as Kate said, too, through their body language around when it's getting a bit tough and when it's time to hold off and stop. And then, again, if it's your role or someone else's, to equip parents and educate them as, after we've had this session today, this might be some of the things that come up for the child at home, rather than just send them home to parents without any forewarning of the challenges that might come up after a conversation like that, and then giving tips and strategies for parents on how to manage, anything concerns they have after that conversation with you.
And for me, I think of it a couple of different ways. I think like having many conversations with people when they're 50 or 60 first disclosing some of these experiences and charting back the influence on their life, that thing. But I think also, it's important that we are thinking about our own vulnerabilities as practitioners, that that is a really legitimate worry. It's the sadness and the hurt this child expressing. Is it damaging to them? Is it damaging to their family system as well? But I think if we can be clearer around our power relationships and language and go in there with a sense of, wanting to make this sort of different, I generally think we're not going to make it worse. And also know from some of the therapeutic work, even knowing the context, I got taught when I was doing particular child sexual assault focused counselling work is there's a couple of things you can start knowing whether, the relationship between the person who abused them, knowing it's in this context uncle, knowing the ages when it happened. But even you can do a lot of therapy work just around their experience of disclosure, like who did they talk to, how did they deal with it? And through that, you can position a lot of your understandings and knowledges about abuse, which doesn't mean going into the specificities of when, how often, and, that may or may not be important. But you can actually present your values and understanding and a framework for that child. Just even talking about the experience of disclosure, there's so many opportunities to position the conversation that will lessen the experience of the trauma of the child. But also knowing as meaning shifts, there's going to be hurt, there's going to be grief, there's going to be loss. Even that meaning making of the uncle didn't do the right thing beyond the experience of abuse and trauma. There's a grief and loss that person was somebody in their life, and now they've realised that they had some different intentions than they thought. There's a loss of that relationship as well, if that makes sense. So there's a grief and loss process, which is hard to sit with kids going through grief and loss. And it's knowing that we will be moved and shifted by some of those experiences as well.
Yeah, your comments about being moved and shifted by them, reminds me of, points to a couple of questions too, really. I guess people were asking those in different ways, but it's really about the potential effects of the work of these conversations on practitioners. Some people use terms like counter-transference even, or, just this sort of other terms that might be used, like it has me wondering about what you would each say about what is it that can help sustain practitioners in this work.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I've certainly experienced my share of vicarious trauma, some burnout around systems, and I feel like I've been very fortunate to have received some solid information on vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, how they differ, how you can notice them, how you can notice the changes in your body's worldview, all of that. And the more experience I have, I learn to just be a bit more attuned to myself and my reactions, and I think that's so important, particularly when you're talking about transfer and counter-transference, noting yourself in the room, what changes about you after the session, before the session, when you're typing up case notes. That can cause trauma, having to relive it all through rewriting it. So strong supervision, strong understanding of those topics, and what you can do to mitigate that, developing your own strategies, but also looking to your supervisor and your organisation for support.
Thanks, Claire. I'm also reminded of the comments you made when we first began the webinar, actually, and you used joy a few times, actually, in amongst all of those, what you've just described. And I sort of also was wondering about the place of noticing that, in your work as well.
Yeah, you're quite right, because in amongst all that, you keep going back to it, though. You keep going on there despite everything else, and it is noticing which part of that, and it's always the time with the child or with the family. For me, when I'm in state in the session, in that moment of communication, that's what sparks my joy. And so noticing that, feeling the feeling that carries away, that I carry out with that.
Thanks, Claire. I'm mindful of the time, everyone, and we need to sort of finish shortly. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of questions that have come in relation to children who've experienced sexual abuse enacted by another child, not much older than them or a few years older than them. And that's been a bit outside of our discussion today. I'd like to acknowledge those questions and perhaps that's a topic that we can address at a later time. So thank you for bringing that to the fore. Those people have asked those questions. Thanks to everyone that's submitted questions. Can I just ask for like a brief 1 minute kind of statement, I guess, for each of our panellists? What's kind of stood out to you from the discussion? What's kind of a key message that you'd really want participants to hold on to from tonight?
I'll go for it. I mean, the bells that ring for me, we've been talking about that all day, actually. The resonance I'm hearing Kate and Claire talk is that importance of the effort that we go to actually set up a space, whether a counselling room, a group, or another activity, where children and young people have a different experience than abuse, where their voices are valued, where their connections, their way of relating is taken care of. And to me, that's that reversing that positive abuse isn't just about perpetrators. It's the way we as a society and community interact and engage young people in really routine ways, which sort of discounts their views, opinions, values as well. So I think if anything we can do to show dignity and respect, and dignity being essential organising principle, I think, of human life. If anything we can do that creates more dignity for families and children and young people, that's to me something that can anchor the wins that they're dealing with as well.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Kate, what about for you? What's something really standing out to you?
Yeah, I think just over the theme of the importance of helping children to be able to make sense of their experiences, particularly if developmentally they don't yet have the cognitive, constructs and language to put words and, adult thoughts to those experiences. And also I'm just really mindful around how so many of the children I work with will have contact with lots of different professionals, and what a role we can all play to create a society that is a safer space for children's experiences and voices to be heard.
Thank you, Kate. Claire, for you, what's standing out to you from tonight?
For me, I hope I don't keep banging on about the same thing, but the importance for me that the journey of the child after they've experienced the abuse, even if they're seeing 3 or 4 practitioners, that will only equal a couple of hours a week or a fortnight in their life. And most of their journey is going to take place in their home with their family and their caregivers. And how can we support those people and wrap around the family system and partner with the family system is most important in supporting that child through that journey, using the strengths of that family, the kinship group, the community.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Thanks to each of you, David, Claire and Kate, for your contributions this evening. I think what really stands out to me is that this work is significant, important, needs careful attention, but is also doable. And so thank you very much for your contributions to our practice this evening. Thanks to everyone that's tuned in to this webinar as well. We'd really appreciate it if you could complete the feedback survey before you log out, either through the banner or typing the URL in or scanning the QR code on your screen. You'll receive a statement of attendance, and you also receive an email with the link to the recording and other associated resources as well. In terms of future webinars, I've mentioned a couple already that are coming up with MHPN and Emerging Minds. They're there again on your screen. MHPN also offering a webinar in relation to mental health and wellbeing in autistic youth and young adults during transitions, and also the online conference that MHPN are hosting at the end of March, Mental Health Care in a Changing World. There's all sorts of think tanks and collab labs and great opportunities to connect and be involved in that, so please check that out as well. MHPN supports over 350 networks across the country where people get together and discuss practice and issues related to working with people. And so, check out their website for a local network in your area of interest near you. or if you want to start a new one, there are people at MHPN that can help you do that and connect with other practitioners similarly interested in your practice area. So I'd just like to again reiterate that this webinar was co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds for Emerging Minds, the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health. The National Workforce Centre is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health program. We'd also like to acknowledge people with lived experience of mental health concerns and people with lived experience of childhood trauma as well, and the ways that they have continued to navigate through life and make contributions to others in their lives. So, acknowledgement again. Please share your feedback. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you very much.